Howdy. Hey there. Look, a packing box. I didn't stage that. That was there before I got here. So it's apt, isn't it? I'm so glad to be here with you guys today. I don't know. Let me just get my hat right. How's that? How does it look? I'm so glad to be with you all this morning. I see Lisa and Betsy are here. If you're here and you're logged on, say hi over in the live chat. If you're not, you can log in if you have a YouTube account, which I think is the same as your Google account. And you can log in that way, and then you can chat on the side and be part of conversation. Usually when I talk for too long and get boring, you can start to talk to each other on the side and just distract yourselves. Or you can ask me questions, since the whole point of our getting together is that people ask me questions and I respond to them as I am able. Luckily, we do have some questions. I'm coming in this morning with some questions that have already been asked. And so we're gonna start with some questions that have already been asked. But if you are joining us live, you are welcome to add questions. I also know Kathy Baggett's with us this morning, but Kathy is not on, I don't think, the chat. But Kathy, welcome this morning. It's good to have you with us as well. Send me a message if you are in. If for some reason you can't connect to the chat, but you want to send me a Facebook message, you are welcome to do so, and I will try to get to it or read it during our time together. We got a couple of really good questions, and then a couple of bad ones. Just kidding. We have a couple of good questions. Leslie's here. Good morning. Good day. Welcome from Canada. Good to have you with us here. It's a joy. And okay, you're gonna like this question, Leslie. You're gonna dig this one. I think everyone's gonna dig this question. Okay, our friend, his name is Mitch Harrelson. Mitch is a member of the church, and one of the first people I met when I moved to Cincinnati. And I still have his cornhole set after 2.5 years, almost 3 years. You're going to want that back at some point, friend. At some point, you should probably get that back. But not today. Not today. Anyways, Mitch sent in a question. It was a phenomenal question. He says, what would have happened? Good morning, Hume Jameson. You're going to like this question too. What would have happened if everyone would have believed Jesus? Not just believed in Jesus, by the way, believed him, right? Like Alt Timeline believed him. No betrayal, no cross, just devout followers. He has a second question, a follow-up question we'll get to in a second. Good morning, Sarah Teresa. Murakami, good to have you with us. So the question that Mitch Harrelson has put before us, what would have happened if everyone would have believed Jesus? Like Alt Timeline, right? Like Alternative Timeline believed him. No betrayal, no cross, just devout followers. I think my answer is going to be really disappointing. So I just want to, let's set the bar really low today. I think my answer is going to be really disappointing. Here's why. But I have a reason why I think it's disappointing, and we'll talk through. We're going to talk this thing through before we disappoint everyone. Okay, so alternative timeline stuff is fascinating, right? Like, what would have happened if, there's that show Man from High Castle, and I know there's other shows that have, like, Fatherland, I think, was a book series or something like that. What would have happened had the Nazis won World War II, right? I know there are several books out there about what would have happened had the Confederacy won. And it's always based on, like, one moment, right? Like, had this thing not happened, had the winds not been what they were on D-Day, or had Hitler developed a working bomb, before we did. I mean, these things are the really fascinating thing about alternative timelines, right? Is it's really hinging on what if this one moment had gone differently. Good morning, John Grover. Ooh, John asked a question. I need to make sure I have John's question up and running as well. But this idea of, like, what if one thing had been different, and the world, and the Nazis had won World War II, or the Confederates had won the Civil War, or right now our current situation in our country, it's like we're living in an alternative timeline where the Soviets won the Cold War. It's kind of what it's like right now, right? So we got that going for us. We're living in an alternative timeline. and that's its own kind of interesting life, isn't it? Yes, Leslie. Yes, Leslie. So here's the thing. All alternative timeline plots depend on the idea of if one thing had shifted, but everybody's personalities and everybody's sort of, the people were the same, the culture was the same, but an incident occurred that shifted the tide, right? So the problem with an alternative timeline Jesus story is the Jesus story is told as inevitable. As in, it wasn't that he happened to be crucified one day. It's not that he accidentally happened upon the wrong people and they disagreed with him. It's not that there was all sorts of agreeable people. So, and you've said this, Mitch, in your question, what if people just all believed him? And to some degree, that's like saying, what if people weren't people? I'm not trying to insult you by responding that way, but like, this is the great prophetic statement of Jesus' presence in the world, which is, and John, the gospel according to John says it really well, right? That the light shone in the darkness, right? That Jesus is present, but that the light came to save the world and the world didn't know him. The judgment that is present in this of our humanity, not as corrupt people, not as we're all terrible, awful. I don't buy into that theology, by the way. But this sort of what do they call it? Total depravity of our character or something like that. I don't buy that. But I do understand the reality that we as humans clearly have this propensity. We are people who are built for love, and that we're yearning for salvation through love. And when love shows up, we don't know how to deal with it. When love shows up, we get resistant. We get scared of what it will require of us. When love shows up in our lives, it requires us to live differently. And we go, no, not like that. I want salvation, but not like that. So the story of Jesus is the story of, and we've got the historical reality that occurred, and I'm a believer, so that in the literal history of this event of Jesus' birth, ministry, death, and in the crucifixion and resurrection. This is a historical event that has had repercussions, but it is also an ongoing prophetic statement about humanity and our experience of love, which is when love is present, we don't always respond. Love wins, but not always because of us. Our love doesn't win. Love wins sometimes working against us because we don't know how to handle it. So to say, what would it have been like to have people believe Jesus? Well, I mean, so let's not dismiss that outright. What it would be like is a people who recognize love, and when love shows up, how might we live in response to that? When God is present in Jesus and says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," what if people said, "You're right, let's"? I guess what I'm getting at is we have the opportunity right now, in this moment, Jesus is here. How will we respond to him? Will we believe Jesus today? Was Jesus a human who was predestined? Sounds very Presbyterian. I've been called worse things than Presbyterian. Jesus seems pretty clear in his language that this is something to which he's destined, but in how we talk about that destiny is tricky. Not because there's a puppet master pulling the strings, but because of the reality of human nature. Jesus is no dummy. He understands the reality of our resistance to a love that would change us and transform us and save us. So it seems very clear to Jesus that death is a given. But the idea that death is a given because it was predestined, rather than it's a given because of God's clear understanding of how we behave and how we respond to God historically and currently, right? Right now, when we have the opportunity to love our neighbor, we oftentimes are choosing to love ourselves instead. I've heard people arguing, I mean, it's crazy, the conversations around mask wearing. You can't make me wear a mask. You know what? No, I mean, there are places that are trying. Obviously, I guess you're right. I guess we can't. It's not for you, it's for other people. Why are we fighting about this, right? Well, we're fighting about this because we care about ourselves and our perceived understanding of our freedom more than we care about each other. And the proof is in the pudding. I mean, we're seeing it. We're seeing the fruits of our obsession with preservation of self, right? So Jesus shows up. What if we believed him and said that you're supposed to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you? And what if we believed him that the widow who gives up a penny has given more than the billionaire who gives $100 million? What if we actually lived as if that were real and not just some story? What if we believed him when he said that God is in control and that we do not need to worry about everything because we are valued? So we can ask that question today, what would it look like? Now, from a theological standpoint, from a systematic theology standpoint, the question then is, do we need the crucifixion to be reconciled to God? What if there hadn't been a crucifixion? Would we not be reconciled? Well, my suggestion would be that if there weren't a crucifixion, it would be because it wasn't necessary, because Jesus showed up. And Karl Barth's an interesting theologian. He is not technically Presbyterian. He comes from a Swiss Reformed tradition, though. And his perspective on this might be getting a little overly nerdy for you guys, and you could be like, I don't care about this. But it's kind of fascinating. He argued that the incarnation of Jesus, the enfleshment of God in Jesus Christ, was and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, while part of the larger Christ event on earth in history, are actually accomplished separate things. That the incarnation of Jesus connects humanity to God in a way that is inextricable and unconditional, and is practical. On a practical level, we are connected to God now in a way we never were before through Jesus. So that event, the event of incarnation, connects us to one another. And crosses that uncrossable gap between human and divine. Right? The Tower of Babel cannot be built. The ladder can't be scaled. Like, we can't get up to God on our own power. So the idea of through the power of God, we get connected to God through Jesus, right? And then the crucifixion is a separate event. The crucifixion is seen as an act of atonement, which can be heard in a lot of different ways. Some people think of it as being punished. Jesus is being punished on our behalf, but it is the ultimate act of, in some ways, condemnation of humanity, that we would kill God when God shows up, but also the ultimate affirmation of God, that God would allow God's self to be killed rather than us. That God would step in front of our. It's not Jesus stepping in front of God's wrath. It's God stepping in front of our wrath for the sake of the salvation of humanity. So what if we believed him? What if they believed him? We'd be in a very different place. What if, but I don't think but we have a story. The thing about the crucifixion story and the story of Jesus is, it's not just that we didn't believe him then, it's that we still don't believe him. That's the actual story, right? The story of Adam and Eve, for instance, isn't about a guy named Adam who took and a girl named Eve who took a bite of some fruit and got kicked out of a garden, and now here we are. The story of Adam is the story of you and Eve. They are the story of us, of you and me, because we currently are living in relationship with God and not trusting, and allowing outside influences to whisper into our ears that perhaps God is not capable, perhaps God is not present, perhaps God is not madly in love with us and caring for us now. So the serpent whispers in our ear, maybe you're on your own and maybe God likes it that way. And the serpent introduces insecurity and fear of relationship. And we're talking about that like it's a historic event. I mean, whether it is or not is actually beside the point. It's a current event. What would our lives look like right now? What is the alternative timeline for the future if we accept and believe Jesus now? Believe in his truth and the things that he teaches, the presence of God, the miraculous power and reconciling healing power, the restorative justice of God in Jesus. How would we approach racial justice differently? How would we approach this pandemic differently? How would we approach our voting differently? How would we care for one another? How would we approach our conversations with one another online and in person if we ever see people in person again? How would we? I kid. We will. We will. How would we approach these differently if we believed Jesus? If we took seriously as gospel Paul's description of community in which people build each other up rather than puff themselves up. People live in service of one another instead of in service solely to themselves. This is the question that Jesus puts to us today. So we have the opportunity to create an alternative timeline. We can have our own alt timeline right now. Mitch has a sneaky follow-up question. Mr. Harrelson does. But I want to check in with Leslie here. You can believe someone and still not like it and act out against them. Humans historically aren't great at communication. I think this is a phenomenal point you make, Leslie. We can, and this is tricky because we want to understand our cognitive belief and how our bodies function. And I would say it's a function of sin or a dysfunction of sin that our stated beliefs and our actions aren't always consistent, right? So the Irish storyteller and postmodern philosopher theologian Peter Rollins, says, if you ask me if I believe in the resurrection, I say no, because I don't love my neighbor. And I don't pray for those who persecute me. Wow, right? So how do we believe? And this is where that's that moment in the Gospels when Jesus says to somebody, believe and you will be saved. And the guy says, Lord, I believe, aid thou my disbelief, because they all spoke in Elizabethan English, or Edwardian English, or whichever one. At any rate, Lord, I believe, aid thou my disbelief. Lord, I believe, help me in my disbelief. That is a human condition. God, I believe in you, and I also don't, because this is scary and I don't know what to do, right? Leslie says the crucifixion seems more like an affirmation of God's love for us and our free will than an affirmation of the general existence of God. Yeah, here's the great thing, I think. The great and terrible thing about being a Christian is there's no proof of God. You can go your whole life not believing in God, and that's your deal. Like, I can't prove it. I never have been able to, and no one ever has. Not really. The idea that God could walk on earth in Jesus Christ, and we could still not believe in God, right? The everyday mundane nature of miracle as occurs in our life here in this world, and the beauty that surrounds us in this life, and we can't see in it the proof of God. Well, there's something beautiful and terrible about that, right? Beautiful that it comes down to actually believing. Terrible that it comes down to actually believing. The crucifixion as the central event in human history, in the Christian narrative, the crucifixion is the central event of all human history. And so it's a lot of things. Yeah, it's the affirmation of God's love for us, and our free will. It's also a condemnation, and we want to be aware of that. It's the condemnation of the people who would choose themselves over a relationship with God. It's the condemnation of the choosing of the status quo over the revolutionary act of living for love. It's the condemnation of saying you want to be saved and then struggling against your liberator. This is the ongoing story of the cross. Now, the story is powerful. One, I believe, because it's historically true and factual, and because of what that fact did. It's also powerful because it colors everything, and in the story, the liberator wins. God is not defeated by our pettiness. When I look at the world today and the things that scare me, about our status and about our state of events, state of affairs. It could be really easy to get cynical, right? And fearful. But God's got us. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to come out of this unscathed. It's not even a guarantee that America emerges from this. But America's not in the Bible. So, but God's love for humanity is. And so how you and I will be transformed and how you and I will be saved in today's reality is the question. Not for me, not if, but how, right? So Mitch Harrelson then asks a question. He's the one I want to remind you who asked, let me find these questions, right? He asked if, what if everybody believed Jesus, then what? Okay. That being said, he says, should a church have a statue of Pontius Pilate? His betrayal is vital and crucial to the whole thing. And then he says, as if to make sure we were not sure, in case we were not sure what he's saying, kind of like having a monument to a Civil War hero. Killer, right? Okay. I don't want to miss Hume before I come back to this question. Hume says, forget who the theologian was, but someone said that humans cannot repay for our sins an original sin because we as humans already owe our lives in service to God and therefore cannot take on the burden of additionally sacrificing for our sins. Therefore, Jesus, aka God, was needed as a sacrifice, as only sacrifice of being on God's level was worthy enough. I think that's it's not Ambrose. It's not Athanasius. It's one of those A names. Alban? St. Alban? No. But yes, you're right. Someone did say that. Not Ambrose, not Athanasius, not Alban. I thought it was an A name. Duh. But yes, a theologian said this. Okay. Should we have statues of Pilate? And by the way, and this is a broader thing, right? Hume, what do we do with this? Because, but the idea is, we're not going to be able to pay our debt. There's problems with understanding the relationship of sin simply as a debt, as if there's a certain number, or as if Jesus is a bookie, right? There's certain aspects of that are problematic, but overall, it's really helpful, I actually think. Okay. Oh, it's way before Austin Ferrer, that idea. We're talking like medieval stuff. Super frustrating. I'm gonna be annoying me all day. I'm gonna message you. I'm gonna text you like in the middle of the night, Hume, and be like, "It was this person." Should we have statues of Pontius Pilate in the church? After all, he was. Oh, and Mitch says, kind of like having a monument to a Civil War hero. After all, none of it would have happened if not for Pilate, right? He's part of our history, right? I'm not sure if you are clear about where I stand on Confederate monuments and statues. They should go away forever and should never have been erected. Period. As Americans, Confederate soldiers fought against America and killed Americans and said they weren't American, which is a treasonous act. The idea of us having I haven't even brought up the supreme evil of slavery. I'm just going to hold that over here for a second. I'm going to bury the lead in a major way. Imagine any other country erecting monuments to a failed treasonous rebellion that killed people citizens of its country, and tried to start its own country. That's absurd, right? And then it turns out that that they were fighting for the right to continue to own humans as property, to kidnap and rape them, to breed them and torture and kill them for their own economic well-being. They called it states' rights. The state right to own human beings, to engage in human trafficking, kidnapping, rape, murder, and torture. That's not okay, right? We're not okay with that as Christians. And then we find out that the statues, by and large, were erected during moments of civil rights era struggle and during times of great pushback to advancement of people of color and specifically of African Americans in our country. And they were erected in areas that would be frequented by Black people in those places that are unavoidable, to remind them that white supremacy as a systemic power was not dead, and in fact was alive and thriving and glorified. Because remember, statues were not put up like textbooks or ways to just teach us. Statues are monuments, are ways to honor something, right? So statues, these statues exist. The Confederate statues are acts of terror. They're literally, and I mean this, terrorist acts. They may be art. That's cool. Like, put them somewhere in a museum. You don't need to deface them if you don't want. But the celebration of humans who fought for the right to own other humans and lost, by the way, and fought a treasonous rebellion that failed, so that they could continue to profit off the kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder of humans. We should not be for this. This should be a no-brainer. I was raised in a very conservative home. I was raised in a very conservative Republican home, and we were like, the Confederacy is bad, and because of slavery, duh. So to me, it's like very much not a partisan issue, and it shocks me that sometimes it's falling in that direction right now. Shouldn't be. This should be straight across the board. Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives getting on the same page. And we could argue about like the way that it should be taken down, I guess. But it's how do we rid ourselves of powerful symbols of white terrorism? That's a good question for the Christian in America to ask. Do we support honoring white terrorism? I hope not. It doesn't seem very Christian to me. It doesn't seem very Christ-like, right? So, statue of Pilate. Well, here's my another disappointing answer. I would say no, but if it's a statue just of Pilate, no. If there is a statue or a depiction that someone does of Jesus and Pilate together that's depicting the moment and in which Jesus is glorified, I'm listening. But yeah, no, you wouldn't just have a Pilate. Like, we've got the stained glass windows up at Redeemer, right, of all of the great white men of church and biblical history. White Isaiah, nope. White St. Peter, nope. You know what I'm talking about. But we've got all these people that even if the stained glass itself, the portrayals of these people is clearly racially and culturally problematic, we are placing stained glass windows of people that we clearly see not just as figures in history, but as people that we are meant to esteem and that we are meant to learn from and that we are meant to honor. And that honor is important. So we wouldn't have a stained glass of Pilate, right? We might have a stained glass of Jesus and Pilate of a moment, but we wouldn't just have a stained glass of Pilate and one of Judas and then say, well, that's our history. It is. And we want to be clear that we want to point towards Jesus, right? So any history that we portray that it's not just the portrayal of these characters. Now, if someone wanted to do a sculpture of Pilate, great. Doesn't belong in a church, like in a worship space as a great figure. That would be problematic. I think that answers that question. But I love that question. I loved both of your questions, Mitch. I hope that you will respond. I hope you listen to this, and that you will respond with more questions. Really important question from Gray, my friend Gray, who's a priest in Baltimore, and he already knows the answer. But he asks the question, are nachos proof of the existence of a God? Yes, they are. Nachos, proof of a God, not only a God, but a good God that loves us. So, and today is Tuesday. I think we're going to do nachos tonight. It is decided. Can you put chicken thighs on nachos? That's weird, isn't it? I got to cook those chicken thighs at some point. Okay, next question. David Cook asks the question, is the Gospel of Thomas heretical? And I'm going to answer with a really definitive maybe. I will confess that I haven't spent a lot of time with the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. Whether or not it's heretical, I think what would be heretical would be to claim that it is one of the Holy Scriptures. Okay. So we want to, and by the way, we get worried about the term heretical, like it means that if I say that you believe something heretical or I believe something heretical, that means that I say you're a bad person and God hates you and you're going to hell. Nah, nope. You and I have probably committed a dozen heresies before lunch. Okay, it's all good. I mean, it's not good, but it's human, and here we are, and we're loved magnificently and held eternally in the competent hands of the God who made us and cares for us and is redeeming us. So we can screw up a lot. As the people who put the Bible together were putting the Bible together, they left certain books out. And some of those books were left out because they were not deemed. I mean, there were some books that were left out because they were just like, nah, this is not true. This is not us. Others were left out because it was like, well, this is good, but, right? So for instance, the Didache, one of the oldest Christian writings, is a collection of, it's almost like it's like a late first century catechism, what it looks like to be entered into the Christian faith. This was considered a document of great authority in the church. And it was in consideration for being part of the Bible, did not make it. There's one called the Shepherd of Hermas. Same. Okay. And there were some other writings like that were held in high esteem by the church, but did not make the cut. So I want to suggest that just because something is not in the Bible doesn't mean it's not worth our time as Christians, and doesn't mean that it's inherently heretical. Okay. To be heretical means to be, in some ways, stating something faulty about something that's not true about the Christian faith as it is inherited to us, as we've inherited it. Saying something that's not true about God. It's different from apostasy, which is a straight up forsaking of the faith. Heresy is oftentimes a good faith effort that gets it wrong at who God is. And I confess that because the gospel, according to Thomas, is not in our scriptures, I have not spent a lot of time with it. What would be heretical would be to hold a book outside of scriptures with the same level of authority as a book that is within our canon. Because our church has decided this is the canon. These are the books that, and it's pointing towards something real about Jesus. Now, again, this doesn't mean don't read all those other books. This doesn't mean they're dangerous. This doesn't mean that you're bad if you look at them. This doesn't mean they can't help you. This doesn't mean anything inherently pejorative about books that aren't in the Bible. If they are not seen as inspired by God to be gathered together in this text that would become authoritative in the life of the church for centuries, that doesn't mean that they are garbage. It's like the whole conversation about the Deuterocanon of the Old Testament, the Deuterocanonical works, which are sometimes called the Apocrypha. Catholics and Orthodox hold these books as Holy Scripture, and Protestants don't, right? Literally, we have a different Bible from each other. Did you know that? We have different books that we recognize as biblical, but this doesn't mean that we have to condemn each other, right? And we want to understand there's a lot. That's a much bigger conversation. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Leslie says shred the chicken. Can you shred chicken thighs? I guess you can. Chicken thighs are just so much better than chicken breasts. I don't have to tell you. But maybe not for everything, right? Like on my Caesar salad, I can do the chicken breast. So chicken thigh nachos, I'm interested. John Grover asked a question. John, if you're still with us, I'm going to look your question up because I don't take this the wrong way. I don't remember it. You asked it and it was good. Or you commented on it and it was good. And I'm just trying to remember if I can remember what it is. Oh, John, where are you in here? Oh, there you are. Hey, look, here it is. I got you, John. Now, John was a professor, so his question is written like one. All right. Given how Jesus dissed the Canaanite woman who asked for his help in healing her daughter suffering with a demon, in parentheses, and by the way, I'm just reading John's question. God sent me only to the lost sheep of Israel, and it is not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs, he said. That is until she groveled, expressed her faith in his power to heal, and begged submissively. You and I have a very different understanding of that story, my friend. I have to wonder if he'd pay any attention to the political protests of non-Jews. Then there's the render unto Caesar message in response to a question about tribute equals deference to the authority of government. Jesus is clearly more concerned about fidelity and devotion to God than in approving or criticizing the political requirements of the state. Indeed, his apolitical behavior and refusal to encourage open rebellion against Roman despotism is thought by some, I gather, to be the reason Judas Iscariot became disillusioned with Jesus' approach to being the expected Messiah. Put simply, he was a spiritual, not a political guy. John, well worded. I disagree with most of it. I love it, though. I love where your head's at. This is good work. Where do I begin in my disagreement? Let's start at the end and go. Let's start at the end and move backwards. Yeah, let's start at the end and move backwards. I'm going to end with the Canaanite woman, but I'm going to start with the notion that Jesus is not political. The fact that Jesus did not advocate, I'm thinking while I talk, so you have to, there's going to be moments where this is kind of disastrous, okay? The fact that Jesus did not advocate open rebellion against Rome does not at all suggest that he's non-political. The very reality of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem on a donkey at the time of the Passover, in the center of Jewish religious, cultural, and political power. Yes, and we were talking about would Jesus protest for Black Lives Matter. We'll get into that for sure. For sure. The fact that Jesus entered into the religious, political, and cultural, and because remember, religion and politics weren't separate in Jesus' time. That's not a thing. So religious, political, cultural power center of Jerusalem, entering into the high holy days for Passover, right? Which is the memorial to and the participation in the liberation of God's people, a liberating act, and try telling the Pharaoh of Egypt that the liberation of Israel wasn't a political event, right? Because his economy was crushed. His oppressive economy was dismantled, and his military strength was vanquished, at least within the story and the narrative we're given. This is to call that, if that happened in our country, if an economy was crushed and our whole system was torn down by God, we would call it political. The Passover is an inherently political. It is an intersection of political and spiritual. Jesus enters like Caesar or an emperor or a conquering general would enter on a white horse into Jerusalem, except he enters on a donkey, which is itself an ironic political statement, not just the fulfillment of a prophecy, but an ironic political statement. The Jewish authorities, and by the way, critiquing Israel for Jesus as a Jew is a political statement. It's not anti-Semitic. He's Jewish, okay? And it's not Jew shaming, and people who take it that direction and go to this place of trying to understand this in the first Christians as separate from the Jews create major problems, including John the Gospeler. His language is deeply problematic for us today, even though his overarching point of who Jesus is well taken. The act of Jesus, he's coming in and they're laying down leaves and calling him the Messiah, and saying, Hosanna in the highest, Lord, save us in the highest. Save us from what? From our political situation. Now, he doesn't advocate open rebellion. The suggestion of the Gospels is that Jesus' work does that salvation. But what happens in the aftermath? What the work of salvation that Jesus accomplishes? How is it lived out? What I mean by that is Christian communities are created in the aftermath of the Jesus event. And how they choose to live tells us something about what Jesus taught and about what the expectations of the Jesus movement were. They live in common. They refuse military service. They refuse to call Caesar Lord, which is not just a spiritual act, but a political act that gets them killed. They share resources and lives across traditional, cultural, and religious and sexual gender backgrounds. Okay. That living in the aftermath of Jesus is all that. How could we, if people lived like that today, would we really call that a non-political act? Is there really such thing as a spirituality that is disconnected from politics? There may be a spirituality that's disconnected from partisanship, but is there a spirituality that is disconnected from the realities of this world and how we live in it? We're talking about Jesus' life and behavior in Jerusalem. We are. Jesus' life and behavior in Jerusalem as a Jew, participating in the Passover and entering Jerusalem is a political act. And the Jewish authorities around him say, you've got to stop your people from cheering you on like this. And in Luke's gospel, he says, if I stop them, the stones themselves would shout, right? This recognition of a salvation that we are waiting on, but the idea that salvation would not have political implications is problematic, which is why you have stories like the story of Philemon, the letter to Philemon, in which Paul writes to Philemon to accept his former slave as a brother. This is a political act, that it shifts and changes the structures of society. If your slave is no longer an inferior, but a brother, can you still call him a slave? If a woman is a bearer of prophecy and can lead a church, how do you deal with that? Right? So I would suggest, and Jesus' acts of defiance of the Sabbath are political acts. Now you mentioned Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto the Lord what is the Lord's. This has oftentimes been interpreted as Jesus basically calling for the separation of church and state. I roundly reject this theory because the coin that Jesus has them show him has Caesar's visage on it, yes, but it says Caesar is Lord. And who's holding the coin that says Caesar is Lord? One of the Jewish authorities. And the Jews believe that there is only one Lord. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. There is one Lord. And Yahweh is his name. Right? The idea that in the midst of the temple, a Jewish authority figure would be holding a coin with the image of a man who claims to be God with a sign that says Caesar is Lord. Jesus says, well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's, right? So we have this recognition of Jesus saying that in that moment is a condemnation of the people who are, it's a self-condemnation. What does belong to Jesus? What does belong to God? What does belong to Caesar? It's a confounding response to a trick question. The question is not asked in sincerity. The person who says, whom should we pay? Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Well, what do you use to pay taxes? You use money with the Caesar's face on it to pay taxes to Caesar. That's on you, right? His refusal, his answer is a non-answer in some ways that shows the false dichotomy into which people have lived. It has political implications. Now let's talk about Jesus and the Canaanite woman. First of all, it's not at all the first instance of Jesus saving or healing someone outside of the Jewish faith. Something he's already done in the narrative. He's healed the depending on your reading in Matthew or in Luke or Mark, the Gerasene or the Gadarene demoniac. But I think Gerasene is the one I remember the best, obviously, because I keep saying it. He's already healed Gentiles. That's not a problem for Jesus. First of all, there was no such thing as a Canaanite woman in that time. It's a term. It would be like me saying Jesus heals the Confederate woman in 2020. It's a term that doesn't apply. It's anachronistic purposely. It's a symbolic term, that suggests, or Syrophoenician is more helpful, and that's the one in Mark. She's referred to as the Syrophoenician woman there, and the Canaanite in Matthew. Either way, she is seen as a Gentile who is, and where is she? Where are they? They're in Gentile territory, and the people to whom she belongs are higher up than Jesus on the racial ladder in the Roman Empire. Well, there's no race; they don't think in terms of race, but in the cultural ladder, in the class structure of the Roman Empire, Gentiles are higher up than Jews, and the Syrophoenicians of Tyre and Sidon have exploited the Jews of Israel and are in a better place economically, and are in a better place, are higher up. They're not first-class citizens, but they're second-class citizens to Israel's third-class citizens. The problem with our reading of Jesus and the Canaanite or Syrophoenician woman as Jesus, the sort of grumpy, privileged white male who's talking down to a woman, honestly, it's that we look at Jesus as the empowered one, the white one, the white male talking down to a poor woman, when the reality is Jesus and her are the same color, but she is in a higher place. She's in a higher class. She is in a position of power and privilege over Jesus in that society. Jesus is a homeless Israelite in Gentile territory, trying to see other Israelites and to minister to them. And this woman shows up and demands his attention, which is a particularly fraught situation, terrifying, I would imagine, for Jesus. If a black man is walking through a white neighborhood and a white woman confronts him, he might be terrified. The power dynamics are not what we suggest they are when we listen to that story, and it's problematic for us in our interpretation. The woman does not grovel. She stands up to him in a really cool way, and he sees her insistence as faith. Not her groveling, but her insistence. He sees her, he understands her tenacity and her recognition of her desire for healing as faith. And he compares it specifically to the people of Israel who say they want salvation but aren't willing to hold on. This is, again, a critique of his own culture. Look, I can find people outside our culture who are perfectly happy to be a part of this thing, right? So the question is, are the Christian political acts that say, now John says Jesus never talked about slavery. All the Christian political acts seem to follow his time and come from St. Paul's interpretations of Jesus teaching about human interactions and the importance of faith and love. This is good work, John. You're doing good work. I love this. Now, Jesus never talked about slavery. Well, he did, but he talked about slavery in ways that perhaps would make us uncomfortable because he uses the analogy of us being slaves and God being the master. Now, of course, we're thinking about American chattel slavery and slavery as Jesus knew it would have been different. It wouldn't have been race-based. It wouldn't have been chattel in the way that we think about it now. People could buy themselves out of it. They were still considered human. They still had rights. Still all very problematic. But Jesus uses it as a way for us to understand something, which is, in the words of the prophet Bob Dylan, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Jesus argues that humans are meant to live in service of one another. To be a slave to God is to be a servant to one another. And this is what Paul makes that implicit claim explicit. Jesus does not abolish slavery. Paul does not abolish slavery. But if you keep following the teachings of Jesus and of Paul's application of Jesus' teachings, it leads you to a place of an obvious abolition of slavery. It leads you to a place of an obvious equality of protection of rights and of privilege in society to women and people of races, of all races, right? Of all races, because white's a race, everything's a race, right? Every different color. But this thing that Jesus does has political implications. We got to see that, guys. I said last week, and John, I don't think you were with us last week, but you asked this question, and it's a good question. You asked it in the thread. We were talking about Jesus in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know. I will continue to say this, because I want all of us to think like this. So I'm going to, as your priest, I'm going to keep repeating certain things until you're either sick of them Oh, I'm going to repeat them far past when you're sick of them. I'm going to, I'm going to beat this dead horse and until you've got it memorized because you're so annoyed with me for saying it. I don't understand the question, what would Jesus do? Because it infers that Jesus isn't here now. So what would Jesus do with the Black Lives Matter? My response is, what is Jesus doing with the Black Lives Matter movement? The Black Lives Matter movement is a political movement that is non-religious, or it may have people of different faiths supporting it, but it is an inherently non-religious movement that insists on the dignity and the equal protection of people of color in this country. As a Christian, if I cannot see my responsibility there, if I cannot see Jesus present in the insistence on equal protection and equal respect of all races, then I'm not sure I understand who Jesus is. And we as Christians, if we only talk about Jesus as a memory or as a historical figure, then we ignore the Christian doctrine, which is that by the power of the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ is present right now in the world. When we are baptized into the body of Christ, which means we are participating with God as the hands and feet of Jesus in the world. So where is Jesus in the Black Lives Matter movement? Jesus is among all those who are striving for justice and mercy, for love and equity. That's where Jesus finds himself. It's not where Jesus would be. It's where Jesus is. I submit, John says, that Jesus would enjoin us to love one another. The rest would follow if that were to happen. I agree. I agree completely. You and I are in lockstep there. For us to love one another would insist on our equal treatment. What we find out is that we live in the real world. This is not a denial of Jesus' statements at all. But we live in a real world with practical political realities, and we live specifically, unlike Jesus, we live in a state, and by state I mean United States, not just Ohio. We live in a country that is founded on the principles of individual freedom and liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the principle of representation under law, equal representation and equal protection. So we're not living like that's true. We have the ability to change the laws and change the power structures in ways that the Israelites did not. We can do it peacefully in ways that the Israelites could not. They could not vote a different system into being. They could not put their money. They could not back specific things financially. They didn't have those choices. So Jesus didn't pretend that they did. We live in a structure that allows that insists upon the enfranchisement of all people, and then allows for and actually states as a principle that you and I and everyone else should have a say in the management of this country, and that our governing authorities should actually be representing us and serving us, not just leading us and telling us. So what does love look like in the face of that system? What does love look like when you live in a world, in a country, actually, that states as a priority the equal rights and dignity of every human being, but then doesn't live it in the reality? Love, and I wrote about this a few weeks back, love is when our actions and when our thoughts and our deeds match, when our words and our deeds are connected. What would it look like for us to create, not just be loving people, but create a loving culture? A culture where we didn't have to tell people to put on masks because they did it. I agree with you. Jesus would enjoin us to love one another, and does enjoin us still to love one another. As I said earlier in this conversation, what would have happened if we had believed Jesus when he first showed up? I say that question should be asked right now. What Jesus is here. Will we believe him? Will we believe him? Yeah, and Judas, and so you bring up this idea in your Facebook post that perhaps, and I know that you mentioned that some have said this, and this is really important stuff, that Judas may have thought that Israel did have the power to rebel, and indeed they did rebel after Jesus' death, and held Jerusalem for a couple months or years before they were finally completely smashed, in the diaspora and the destruction of the Second Temple. But Judas, it's possible, some theorize, we don't know, some theorize that Judas thought Jesus was here to overthrow Rome, that this Messiah would bring earthly power of violence to destroy the oppressor. And when it became apparent to him that Jesus was not going to do that and would not advocate for that, Judas rebelled. I've also heard it said, John, that Judas thought that Jesus would do it, and Judas was forcing his hand, right? So this is why Judas kills himself after Jesus dies and not before, right? Because maybe he's waiting. He's waiting to see Jesus. I've forced Jesus' hand. Now it's got to happen. Now the power of God has got to conquer these SOBs. And that doesn't happen. So there's a couple different theories about that. Is no question that Jesus' teaching and Jesus' way of being in the world is incredibly frustrating to those of us who would want to see a show of force in traditional senses of that word. That Jesus and all the angels didn't show up with their heavenly weapons, spears and swords and bows and arrows, and kill the Roman occupiers is incredibly disappointing. Jesus is an immensely frustrating person to follow in that sense. Right now, for those who believe in the struggle for racial justice, who believe there is a struggle to be had, because there are some people in our country who just who think we're making something out of nothing. But for those of us who believe that there is something to be done, it is tempting for us to dehumanize and advocate for violence against those who propagate and support and defend white supremacy, including those in power. There is a tendency and a desire, a deep temptation in our righteous zeal to dehumanize and, to put it biblically, to crap all over those with whom we disagree, those whom we believe deeply are wrong, those that we believe are actually committing acts of evil. There is something deeply, deeply like human about us wanting to think awful things and maybe even hope awful things about those people, to speak about them, right? So it's incredibly frustrating when Jesus says the way forward is in love and requires us to recognize the humanity and dignity of the people that we oppose. Not so that we don't oppose them, by the way, but so that in our opposition, we love, right? An opposition in love. Jesus, if we follow Jesus into this work of love, opposition in love, we're meant to participate in the liberation of all people. See, the love of Jesus doesn't have to destroy a Roman, but it might destroy the Roman Empire. But the destruction of the Roman Empire might be the thing that liberates many of the Roman soldiers who are fighting and killing and dying for the wrong thing. How might a reformation, how might we recognize a reformation of the way that we police in this country? We talk about how it will, for those of us who believe that that might be a thing to do, we talk about that in terms of how it will free those people of color who are being disproportionately burdened and harmed by our current policing system. That's a good conversation. That's important. And we should be talking about how the human beings that become police officers shouldn't be being put into the position they're currently put in. That it's dehumanizing to them to ask them to do these things. It's like, well, that's a whole other. We have to teach people to do these things, to dehumanize, and it dehumanizes you when you dehumanize others. John Grover, we hippies were right, I think. Make love, not war. I mean, love is war, man. Love is a war against violence. Love is a war against hatred. Love is not passive. Nonviolence does not have to be inactive, inert, or ineffectual. But it requires sacrifice from us. Where will Jesus be in you and in me? Where will we find Jesus in our lives, not just around us? When I ask people where they saw love today, but how will we follow that love? How will we follow Jesus today? It's got to be transformative, right? Jesus is present right now. Will we believe him? Will we believe him? Mitch Harrelson, you helped me a lot with that question. I thought I was going to go one way with it, but you helped me with it. You helped me. That's good. Thank you for that. Thank you. Okay. New Dylan album. Can listen to that still. Can't get over this Ella Fitzgerald record. It's her, and it's called The Complete Piano Duets, and it's like 2 hours of just Ella Fitzgerald and this piano. I keep talking about it. I can't stop listening to it. My wife has not kicked me out yet, but I cannot stop listening to it. I was listening to this David Bowie album, Station to Station. Probably my second favorite Bowie album now. It's phenomenally good. It's perfect from beginning to end. Some good spiritual songs on that album. Great rock. And he was so coked up he doesn't remember making it. Well, he doesn't remember anything now, but you get my point. That was dark. Okay. What else have I been listening to? I did a little Elton John's Greatest Hits yesterday. Yesterday was my dad's birthday, and we used to listen to that together, so that was fun. Okay. So listen to some good music this week. Take care of each other. Love one another. Leslie, you can ask the question now, and I will answer it next week. Because I do need to wrap up, because I'm not going to hold you guys here forever and ever. But if you ask it now, you can either ask it right here and I'll write it down, or you can message me, and I will respond beginning of next week. That'll be the first question out of the gates. Okay. I thank you so much to you all for being here today. Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, John. Thanks, Hume. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all who I don't know were here or who watch this later. Hope you'll join us next week. I hope you'll invite others. We're creating a beautiful little community here. And we're having, I know it's mostly me talking. I get that. But the questions you all are asking and the interactions we're having and the thinking through this stuff together is really exciting for me. And I think it's meaningful to us to have this opportunity to connect. So thank you so much. John, I agree so much. I wish we could interact in person. If you want to put some masks on and hang out with me outside 6 feet from each other, we can do that for sure. I'm in. So let me know if that's a thing you'd like to do. Send me a message and we will find time for each other. But I cannot wait for when we can all be together again in the way in which we're accustomed. I got a lot of hugs to give when the time comes. But in the meantime, I love you all. I'm grateful for our time together, for your being a part of this. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Okay. Be well and have a good week.